Judith. How are you?
Okay. How are you?
Okay. I think that's as good as can be expected in terms
Yeah.
of how we're doing. Thank you so much for joining us today. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, it's my pleasure.
Okay, well, let's just get straight into it. We tend to think of striving for nonviolence in our movements and activism as a moral decision, but nonviolence isn't only a way to keep our conscience clear. It's a political struggle and a form of resistance. Today, I'm joined by Judith Butler, whose new book, The Force of Nonviolence, an Ethico-Political Bind, is out, and you should get it. Butler is a philosopher and gender theorist whose work has influenced generations of feminist and queer liberation activists. She is the Maxine Elliot Professor in the Department of Comparative Literature and the Program of Critical Theory at the University of California, Berkeley. She's the author of Gender Trouble. Everyone knows that one. Precarious Life, Frames of War, and Towards a Performative Theory of Assembly. Professor Butler, thanks for joining us today.
Yeah, it's my great honor and pleasure.
So it's a good time to talk about this subject, I think. Can we start by defining what violence is exactly in your view? Is violence contained to physical aggression?
Well, that's a good question. And of course, we know that there's military violence, and we also talk about prisons as violent institutions. I think Black Lives Matter has made that into one of its central claims or issues. And we even talk about people being violent with one another without necessarily hitting one another. So I don't think we can take the physical blow as a paradigm for thinking about violence. But, it may be that thinking about nonviolence is a little bit different. It's not just the absence of violence. It's actually a set of practices and even a philosophical and political approach to the world.
What can you talk a little bit more about what that is? How do we start to understand it, given that our world seems so based in violence?
Yes, well, most people identify nonviolence, with creative nonviolent practices, which is an important tradition across the globe now for many resistance movements. And they also associate it with Gandhi and the extraordinary philosophy and set of practices, including the strike and the hunger strike, that he promoted in India as it was seeking to liberate itself from British colonial rule. And all of these are incredibly important historical and contemporary instances of nonviolence, ways of thinking about nonviolence as collective practice, for instance. I get worried sometimes that people think that nonviolence is just refraining from hitting someone or refraining from doing a violent thing. So it's not an action. It's a way of refraining yourself from acting. But look, I think that mobilizations against war, mobilizations against military spending, those are nonviolent politics. Those are politics that are opposing violence, and they are proceeding, for the most part, in nonviolent ways. So they're exemplifying the world they want to bring into being.
I love what you said in the book about nonviolence does not necessarily emerge from a pacific or calm part of the soul. I'm pulling a quote out here. You say that very often it's an expression of rage, indignation, and aggression. A practice of aggressive nonviolence is therefore not a contradiction in terms. I feel like we saw that. Well, we keep seeing that. We see that with the Black Lives Matter movement. We see that with people who are just absolutely enraged over what's happening to the children and families at the border. Can you talk a little bit more about what you meant there?
Well, I think that we imagine sometimes, and not always, that nonviolence involves establishing internal equilibrium and a calm perspective on things and getting rid of our aggression and becoming non-aggressive creatures. But first of all,
religions around the world keep telling us that that's what we have to do, especially as women.
I mean, and sometimes, that form of nonviolence, which is a form of pacifism, and many distinctions here, like kinds of pacifism. But let's just say there's a form of pacifism that is really about not engaging in aggression, not engaging in rage, but finding a certain kind of calm and staying with the calm. Now, I like calm, and I think good thinking comes from calm, but you can be calm and angry. You can be calm and fierce. You can be thinking clearly, slowly, and well about what to do about a completely unacceptable situation, like the detention of people at the borders, the separation of children from their families, the destruction of the rainforests in Brazil. You can be also calmly thinking about how to make an aggressive response to these modes of destruction in our world and to stop them. So I think aggression comes with us as creatures. I guess I believe that, of course, we're aggressive, and aggression is not the same as violence. I mean, you can be aggressive, you can be taking action, you can be feeling rage, you can be utterly absorbed by rage. At the same time, you can be thinking and acting in ways that don't bring more violence into the world, right? So if I'm rageful and if I'm about to act, I can ask myself with others, and this is almost always a collaborative or collective activity, am I strategically right in the action I'm about to take? Is this going to make a difference? But also, am I ushering in more violence to the world, or am I taking violence out of the world? Am I decreasing violence from the world? So
you don't notice a lot of fascists sitting around talking about how to be nonviolent because it's the best way to, get their agenda across. Can we talk about and is this just a moral, is it just a moral imperative that we, as good moral people who want to do hopefully good moral things, be nonviolent, or are there inherent strengths in nonviolence that are tactical, or both?
They're tactical, but they're also, to a certain degree, principled. I mean, if we engage in nonviolent action against racism, or against extraction in Latin America, or against the treatment of immigrants in Greece or in the Mediterranean, where they're too often detained or abandoned or left to die, we take aggressive action. We move, we act collectively. And as we do so, at least in my view, we start to exemplify among ourselves the world we want to live in, the world we think should come into being. In other words, that's a world in which people understand themselves as responsible for each other's lives, as equal to one another, as seeking to build infrastructures that sustain life and help give migrants the rights and healthcare and shelter that they deserve. So we are constantly in our action exemplifying the principles according to which we all want to live. So it's a social and political philosophy and vision. And that's why it's not just an individual decision. It's actually a collective and collaborative decision. How does our action exemplify the world, the structure of the world, the principles that govern the world that we want to bring into being?
How these days we watch the United States regime, blinding journalists, tear gassing nonviolent protesters. How can nonviolence win against a state that is intent on using violence against us?
Well, I think Martin Luther King had some pretty great answers to that, and even Malcolm X came around to see that that nonviolence was actually very powerful, right? So we have to be able to understand that striking, that demonstrating, that bringing industries to a halt that are poisoning the earth, that these are all actions, strong actions, powerful actions that communicate that we've had enough of this, we are indignant, and we're not going to sit by. I mean, I thought it was incredible during the height of the Black Lives Matter demonstrations, and I hate to talk that way because I don't want to think they're over. They're not over, and they're coming back, I'm sure.
Yes.
But
they're still happening, just not getting a lot of reportage right now.
All the time. And unfortunately, the reason they are happening is that Black people are being gunned down or, choked or killed all the time. And, my sense was that every time the police or the white supremacists committed acts of violence, people were going to show up in large assemblies, and they weren't going to go home. They were going to stay out on the street, and they were going to make it known, and they were going to call for justice, and they were going to mourn the dead, and they were going to call for justice at the same time. So these have been powerful collective actions that stopped the world and brought its attention, and I believe brought attention to the issues in a way that I think has never happened before. We suddenly see, journalists like writing on race who never did before, right? Or that issue being front and center, not a periphery subject, not a secondary subject. So I think that it's really important because many people are, especially during COVID, caring for one another, offering each other shelter, support, precisely because social services are underfunded, because the government has abandoned us, or it's unleashing the virus on us by its action and by its negligence. And these kinds of forms of support and forms of action are, they're microcosms of society. They're ways in which they embody, they represent, and they enact ways in which we want to live together.
You say in the book that nonviolence doesn't make sense without a commitment to equality. What do we do when half of us have a commitment to equality and a large portion, I don't know if it's a half, I don't know if I have my, numbers right here, but when there's a portion of people, specifically those in power, who are not, they don't have that commitment to equality.
Well, we chase them out of power. That strikes me as a perfectly good nonviolent tactic. We chase them.
We're working on it.
Yeah, we're working on it. No, I mean, we have to play power politics. I don't think power is violence. I mean, many people say, oh, aggression. If you're aggressive, you're violent. It's like, that's not true. We can cultivate aggression. Or they say, oh, if you're nonviolent, you took away your power. It's like, no, nonviolence can be enormously powerful. Look at the civil rights movement. Look at Selma. I mean, these are enormous nonviolent actions. They brought down colonial rule. They've stopped industry in their tracks. The strike, the labor strike, the hunger strike, these are nonviolent actions that have made a huge difference in the world. It's why we struggle for the right to strike as a collective right.
So we have labor's intersection with nonviolence. Can you talk about feminism's intersection with nonviolence? I recognize that's broad, but I would just like to hear where you'd like to go.
No, that's good. And then let me come back to equality, if I may. Well, first of all, some of the largest feminist organizations and movements in the world right now are focused against violence against women, trans people, gay and lesbian people, non-gender conforming people, bisexual people, intersex people. I mean, this is a very large coalition. It's an ongoing coalition of people who not only are opposing rape and sexual violence, but harassment and demeaning treatment or imprisonment. This is huge, and there is, I think, a very strong critique of violence that has become socially and historically a masculine prerogative in many countries, including our own, such that beating or raping your own wife is still considered to be a privilege and a power that no state should take away. And fighting that is incredibly hard. And many men will not say, oh, this is my right, and here it is. It's writ somewhere. It's not writ somewhere. It's actually an unwritten law that men pass on to each other. It's like, yes, you get to treat women this way. And so, the feminist movement has been an anti-violence movement for a very long time. It's also been a pro-equality movement for a long time. And And sexual violence is one main issue, but women suffer violence, including in forms of institutional violence like incarceration, at great numbers, and that's part of what the critique and the resistance has to be. We are opposed to the blow, we are opposed to physical rape, but we're also opposed to institutional forms of violence that keep women from having access to education or shelter or proper health care, right? Those are also forms of abandoning lives and establishing inequalities.
You talk about the idea of grievability. Can you talk about what you mean by that?
Well, I think many of us who live with economic privilege or within institutional or community infrastructures that really support us, we do have a feeling that, our lives are constantly being protected and we are being looked out for. And if something bad were to happen to us, or if we were to die, people would grieve us. That would be marked. There would be an event. There would be many people whose lives would be transformed if my life came to an end. But if you're living in a world that does not give you health care, or it's inaffordable, or you go there only to experience discrimination, racial discrimination or gender discrimination, then your life is being treated as a life that is dispensable. In other words, if your life were lost, nobody would mourn you. But that is what the institution that denies you fundamental care tells you. Your life is not worth safeguarding. And if you were to die, you would not be grieved. Your loss would not be marked. Your loss would not matter. So actually, as a living creature, if you're living with this sense like this life doesn't matter and I could disappear at any point and nobody would care, or maybe my family and my friends would care, or my local community, but not this government and not this regional government and not this hospital and not this educational institution, then you are being treated as someone whose life is supposed to go. It's supposed to vanish.
I feel like we're seeing that a lot with the Trump administration's disregard for the type and amount of people who are being killed by the coronavirus.
Yeah, and I think it's really interesting you use the word killed, because if Black and brown communities are disproportionately being affected, it's precisely because they don't have access to the healthcare, or they haven't had access to the healthcare from the beginning of life or for decades, and that has produced pre-existing conditions and vulnerabilities, and their hospitals are overrun, or they don't have primary care physicians who are looking out for them, or they have deep distrust of those hospitals where they've not been treated well before, or they've seen terrible care. They've seen that Black and brown lives are not cared for in the same way. So here's where that deep sense of social inequality also, gives many people the sense that their lives are dispensable, and that they're not as valuable as others. They would not be mourned. They would not be grieved by those institutions, because those institutions have already decided they are worth losing.
It's so interesting that the grievability, I guess, zeitgeist and the Black Lives Matter, Blue Lives Matter sort of kerfuffle that's coming up. It seems like Black Lives Matter as a slogan for the movement speaks right to this idea that you're talking about. And then when the Blue Lives Matter people, I drove past a Blue Lives Matter protest over there this past week. I don't know. And it's almost like, how could you not? I don't know. It's what am I saying? It's like, how could you not think? Black Lives Matter, but police are always grieved when they are shot and killed. Or whatever, however they die. And Black people are not. So we've got this example of what you're saying.
Well, I think it's true. I mean, to be fair, there, depending where you are in the country, there are Black, brown, and white policemen, and there are differences among them. But it is true that the killing of a police person it's not only more fully criminalized and more fully punished, But it also becomes a moment where, oh, our society is being attacked. Those who protect us are being attacked. This is an antisocial action. This is against us. It's against the nation. It's against patriotism, right? For a policeman to be killed in a battle of some kind. But I mean, people are not shooting down police randomly. They're not running after police in parks and shooting them down as somebody's like facing the other way. They're not putting them in chokeholds in the way that we are seeing Black men and some women too gunned down or choked or randomly killed when they're in their beds, like Breonna Taylor.
It does seem like when the Blue Lives Matter protesters are out, they have a subtext on their sign. They don't print it on there, but it's like, no, Blue Lives Matter more than Black lives. It seems,
Yeah.
And when you say, well, both of these could actually be true, that's not very popular, because it doesn't show what side you're on. Exactly.
Yeah. Well, I think the problem is that it's a false notion of equality. They're saying Black Lives Matter and we're saying Blue Lives Matter. And it's very much like the older argument, white lives matter too, right? Like, don't all lives matter? Why do we have to distinguish at all? And of course, all lives should matter. And in principle, there is no reason why all lives should not matter. But that vision of radical equality is nowhere instanced in this world in which some lives matter more than others. And the Blue Lives Matter, I mean, that plays into the whole idea that police only kill from self-defense, right? Or that even when somebody is unarmed, they can say, I killed this person from self-defense. Even if this person is running away, they can say, I killed from self-defense. And so it plays into this rationale that the police give for doing violence and murderous violence against communities of color.
How can we reconcile the idea that sometimes when you're abiding the law, you can actually be in service to state-sponsored violence? For example, I pay my taxes and then the government uses them to kill Black and brown people in other countries. Like can you talk about that?
Well, look, I think it's extremely important to evaluate the laws that you are and are not going to follow, and that we do need to exercise judgment. Law governs us to some degree, but we also get to ask all kinds of questions about law itself and the service of the state, and laws in particular. Is this one just? Is it not just? And in some cases, right, in taxpayer resistance movements, people do not pay out of principle, or and that is a moral principle that's used to judge a political situation. It's a place where a question of morality and a question of politics actually meet. The two of them meet, and I think that we are obligated to judge. I mean, Hannah Arendt, in writing about the Nazi regime of law, when Eichmann said, I was just following the law, and she says, well, he's dead, but she's saying to him effectively, it was your obligation not to obey that law. It was your obligation to judge that law. It was your obligation to break that law and to bring down that legal regime while you're at it.
There's so much violence, again, going back to the issue of immigration. So many of the arguments on one particular side, not the right side, are, well, they're breaking the law. Well, you made these unjust, horrendous laws, and now you're saying, well, I'm on the side of law and order, and these people are breaking the law, which is particularly egregious to me as a first-generation American, where these other folks are second or third generations where they've changed the laws, and so they can say, oh, well, when we came over, we were legal, but there's no path to legality now. It's just, I can't believe it.
The U.S. is in violation of international law, and it has withdrawn from almost all of its international covenants. But under international law, anybody who enters this country, no matter how they enter, deserves an asylum procedure and a review and a fair review, and they also deserve decent treatment. So the U.S. is in flagrant violation of that law. Now, when Trump and his cronies say law and order, what they're really saying is unleash the police on migrants. They're not talking about following a law. They've already broken the laws that don't suit them. So they are the lawless ones. I mean, look at Trump's behavior now. You can just see it. He doesn't care about regulations. He doesn't care about anything, right? He's just going to do what he wants, and that's his freedom. So when he's not talking law and order, which really means police power, he's talking personal freedom, which is also in his case destructive and potentially and actually lethal, depending on which circumstance we're looking at.
What do you think of the idea that violence might actually be necessary to defeat an armed fascist militia?
That's always the hard one. People say, like, well, what would you do? And I think, well, first of all, let's think about what we mean by violence there. Sometimes we imagine like taking our bodies to the street and fighting. And, a lot of people are not able-bodied, and it's not possible to fight in that way. But they can be part of an active resistance movement. Even the anti-fascist movements had people who were writing things, who were part of the communication network, who were figuring out travel and food and how to sustain the resistance movement. There are a lot of different aspects to a movement that resists fascism. I do think getting someone to leave power or pushing someone to leave power is a really important act, and we may have to learn how to do that, probably through absolutely mass demonstrations, also through really good lawyers and networks of solidarity that are overwhelming, right? I think the power of an expanding, loud, present network of solidarity is more powerful than blasting the White House or attacking police physically or that kind of thing. I understand, actually understand really well what it means to want to do violence, to any number of people. And part of my point is like, yeah, we do want that. We wish for this one to be dead, and we want to do violence to that one. And that's part of who we are as people who feel enraged and appalled by what's going on. We imagine violent solutions as effective ones, but actually, after the violence, then what? I mean, after the violence, then what? I mean, anarchists have many ways of talking about sociability, or they have many ways of talking about community self-governance that's not based on a state formation. And I find those ways of thinking extremely interesting, and I read them quite happily. And hopefully.
I know it's hard. When I think about the question myself, what I think of is, because I have a toddler who loves to fight the power, and right now I'm the power, and I'm looking forward to her turning that onto, but sometimes the fighter, sometimes the boundaries are necessary, and I'm not suggesting violence against children, but sometimes when you're holding a boundary of a peaceful environment, there has to be this, this stopping point, and there will always be friction at the stopping point.
I think there's always friction at the stopping point. If we think about human barricades, for instance, I mean, that's force. Police come against you with force. You hold onto each other. You're linked. You agree. Your body is in the force field of violence, right? But you're trying to stop that force. You're making yourself into a barrier that stops that force. I find that to be an incredibly powerful nonviolent action. Doesn't mean it's not in the force field of violence. It is. It's right at the center.
It's like the your intention is where we figure out if we're violent or nonviolent. right?
Well, I don't know if it's intention. It's actually effect. It's like if you think about the human barrier, I mean, it stops police from moving through. It forces them to display their own violence, right? And you're a foil. I mean, you're actually doing something physically, right? So physical action is great. Physical action is not the same as violent action. But if you're going to start to beat them, or you're going to start to shoot them, or if you're gonna explode their living quarters, I kind of feel like then you may well be entering into tactics that are not world building.
We're speaking with Judith Butler, the professor and author of The Force of Nonviolence. Can you talk about your hopes for the book? Why was it important to you to write this book right now?
I don't know. I think I've been thinking about this topic for a long time. And here at UC Berkeley some years ago, many of my students were involved in mass protests opposing tuition hikes and opposing the exploitation of their work as graduate student teachers, and they were opposing the privatization of the university, and what that meant for adjunctification, people getting hired at very bad salaries and not even having health care.
Former adjunct right here. Yes, no, I know exactly what's going on.
I mean, they were attacked by police. You know, I was really shocked to see batons come out. We ended up censoring our chancellor at the time, but I would get calls in the middle of the night, like, can you bail me out and get me out of this prison? They're really not the place to be. And so, I became more interested in, and I was on the review of the police, the university review of the police actions. And it was very clear to me that the police were going to justify everything they did with all of these ridiculous arguments of self-defense. And even at one point they said, well, when police act, police do not act violently. They only act with legitimate force or legitimate coercion. And I thought, oh, tricky semantic distinction. And then I thought, under what conditions do people say this and that? You know, the police say, oh, this is coercion or this is self-defense. And of course, I have been following the instances of police brutality against Black and brown people since Rodney King, and I wrote about that many years ago, and was amazed by the arguments they give to rationalize their violence as somehow legitimate force, and to take peaceful protesters with legitimate claims as, to describe them as violent or to describe them as a riot that needs to be contained. And we are seeing that in parts of the world right now. We're being asked to accept that way of understanding mass demonstrations, mass and just demonstrations, that they're riots, that they're violent. So I became kind of interested in how these terms are used, and whether we can also say, with clarity, like, that's not violence and this is nonviolence. And so I guess I started writing about this from a sense of rage.
Sometimes I feel like when a bank or whatever gets put up on native cemetery, that's violence. And then, if protesters are like, let's take this bank down, is that violence? If it's, gets sticky. It's a sticky area.
Well, that's right. It's why we also need an arsenal, as it were, an arsenal of words, an arsenal of conceptual analyses, and we need legal arguments. We need political arguments that can actually expose that ruse for what it is, and make sure that our basic rights of public assembly, association, and expression are defended during this time, because they are under attack, and it is more important than ever to be able to mobilize, even under the pandemic, whether that's in person in a mass demonstration, honoring safe protocol, which is, I think, what has happened and is happening with Black Lives Matter, or through networks of solidarity, or even in community associations and networks of care. So we need to extend and mobilize those networks of solidarity, whether they're on the street or virtually.
I love this because I get to interview so many interesting people, and the answer is always the same: get into solidarity with groups of people. That's how we fight against Fox News. That's how we fight. It's all the same. So I'm glad, because we're fighting on many fronts these days, and the answer seems to always be the same. So
but let's remember, solidarity is not always love. Like I don't always love the people I'm in solidarity with, but sometimes I understand that politically I need to be connected here, even though I don't want those people for dinner.
Right. It's principles above personalities. I've heard it put. Yes. Thank you, Dr. Butler, or Professor Butler, or is it Dr. Butler? Did I screw it up? Okay. We've been speaking with Judith Butler. The new book is The Force for Nonviolence, an Ethico-Political Bind. I really appreciate you being on the program here today. It's been a pleasure to speak with you.
Well, it's a great pleasure, Julianna. Thank you so much.
Thank you. You're watching ACT.TV. If you are watching us on YouTube, don't forget to subscribe to our channel. We try to bring you this kind of talk as much as we possibly can. What a joy that was, Judith Butler. And I had to stick to talking about nonviolence, and I wanted to talk about everything else too. But, I could have taken up her entire afternoon. I'm Julianna Forlano. Follow me on Twitter if you like. Follow ACT.TV across platforms. Thanks again for watching. We'll see you tomorrow when we have Bob Furtick from Democrats.com coming on the program. Bob Furtick. I have to give you full disclosure. Bob Furtick helps us run ACT.TV. So, but he has something to say and something very important to tell us. So he'll be on tomorrow. Stay tuned. Stay well. See you in the morning.